Intuition versus sensing. I almost got you there. What is the real difference between intuition and sensing? The N and the S, that second letter in your 16 personalities type. This is like one of the more abstract concepts in Myers-Briggs. I should just get into the heart of the video, shouldn't I? Yeah, why keep talking about it? Let's just get into it. Let's just talk about intuition. So first of all, the intuitives, they prefer to look at overviews of things and speak in terms of the overviews of things rather than do what the sensors do, which is get into the details. To the sensing types, the details are important. The overview, that's secondary. We need to establish the details first. It's the opposite for intuitives. They're like, let's do the overview first. The details, we'll fit that in later. Now, right away, I want you to realize that both do both. Maybe they don't always do both, but they are capable and oftentimes aware of both the overview and the details. It's just one takes precedence over the other. They focus more on one than the other. And I think with intuitives, what it is that they want to focus on that overview to give you the context so that the details can be put together easier. And maybe you don't have to have all the details. I'll give you the overview, I'll give you a few details, and because I gave you the context, you should now be able to fit it all together yourself. When intuitives are telling you about something, they'll usually start with an overview. They won't jump right into it. Do a little experiment. Go on YouTube and watch a bunch of people. You can identify the intuitives a lot of times by the fact that they'll start off with this long intro that's like, this video is about, and it's just like, dude, get into the video. Now, of course, after a while, good YouTubers, whether they're intuitive or sensors, they will figure out, oh, I just need to get into the info. But intuitives have that learning curve. They're always gonna do the overview. The flip side of that is that sensors not giving you the overview will sometimes leave you in the dark about how are these details connected? Why are you telling me this right now? What's the context? For them, they're like, context, you'll get the context by the end. Why start with the context? Intuitives, likewise, will summarize a lot of times without giving too much detail. Whereas the sensing types will give detail and not summarize. Again, on YouTube, you'll see this where intuitives, if they're not the most experienced YouTubers, they'll start with an overview and then they will do a summary at the end of the video. It's like, dude, you don't need to tell me what I just watched. This isn't a 5-paragraph essay. Sensing types don't really like summarizing and boiling down the details because if you do that, then you are disrespecting the details and you might convey something in a way that is not accurate. As such, intuitives a lot of times make errors of fact because they're disrespecting the facts. They don't care as much about the facts. Like, sure, I should get the facts right at some point, but if I got the overview, if I gave you the summary and the context and that is all solid, if I get a few details wrong, it doesn't really matter. To the sensors, it's like, no. Sensors a lot of times won't even say something unless they know it's factual. They'll be like, okay, don't quote me on this, but I'm not sure if this is accurate. It's like, dude, you don't have to prove everything. Everything doesn't have to be 100% right. But for the sensors, yes, they don't want to make errors of fact. So to summarize, now moving on to another point, it's not just about overviews versus details, it's also about patterns versus the actual events. So because the intuitives are keeping their eye on the overview, they become aware of the patterns very quickly that the facts create. And they value those patterns more than the facts themselves. And of course, if you've caught on to the pattern, sensing types are the opposite of that. They prefer to just look at the facts. To them, it's like, sure, there might be a pattern, but what I can really see, what I can really prove are the facts in front of me. Let me emphasize this once more. Oh, I almost got you again. Both do both. Intuitives see the facts and the patterns. They just give way more weight to the patterns. Sensing types see both. They just focus on the facts. I think a lot of times we act like types are robots, or you got like half your brain cut out, and it's like, I am an intuitive, I do not see facts. I am a sensor, I am incapable of seeing patterns. Now look, yeah, it gets to a point sometimes where they overemphasize one over the other so much that it seems like, dude, why didn't you see that fact right in front of you? Why didn't you see that pattern that was clearly developing? It happens, but it doesn't mean they're incapable of seeing the other side. And it gets to the point where they will ignore it. The intuitives will see facts, but they will ignore them if they don't seem to line up with the pattern that they are perceiving. Sensors will ignore patterns that they have become aware of, but it's just like, maybe we should just go back to the information, back to the facts, and see if that pattern really is actually there. This next thing doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's so interesting. It is categorizing. Intuitives love to lump things together. I mean, it goes along with overviews and patterns, right? This is adjacent to that, categorizing stuff. Instead of looking at each thing individually, let's lump it all together. Sensing types don't like categorizing things in that same way. They would rather keep things separate, look at each individual thing as its own thing. Sure, I can see the categories, but that's not as important as the thing itself. You'll find when you're talking to intuitives that they try to avoid specificity as much as possible and will stay in the level of categories. They just don't want to use the brain power to like come up with examples, to like pick out specific things that they're talking about. They're like, it's this general category. Pick anything in that category, it probably fits whatever I'm talking about. Sensors, on the other hand, feel like that is reckless. Why would you do that? You got to be specific and talk about what you are actually talking about. You need to give examples to prove whatever you're trying to say. Sensors are kind of like the people who are like, picks or it didn't happen. I need proof, and I can't prove something to you if I just lump things together. You got to watch out, because I think this is what makes it so interesting, is that a lot of people think, oh, if I hear someone talking about the real world all the time, they must be a sensing type. But this will trip you up, because intuitives talk about the real world all the time. They will just lump things together and categorize things. And this is where you can catch some of those sneaky intuitives who on the surface you might think they're actually a sensing type, but when you really listen to what they're saying, they are categorizing the S out of things. Literally, they are categorizing the sensing out of things. Oh my gosh. Frank, you're not as dumb as you look. Now here's a really interesting one. A lot of intuitives, not all of them, but a lot of them love to talk in analogies. In other words, they will be like, this thing is like this other thing. Now this is where you can get tripped up, is that all types, you can be a sensing type and use analogies. I think everyone to a degree finds that analogies are a good way of kind of clarifying what we're talking about. This is like this in the same way that this is like this. You get what I mean? The thing is that intuitives, that's the way that they just like prefer to talk, in a way where it's like you get lost. An intuitive will be like, if I just give you a really good analogy, that's all I have to give you. I don't even have to talk about the real thing. Sensors will be more like, okay, yeah, I can give you an analogy to clarify a little bit, but then I actually have to explain what I am talking about precisely in the sensory. Oh man, I'm trying to come up with an example. Another thing I've noticed is that when sensing types make analogies, which they do often, so don't just say, oh, analogy, that's an intuitive type. No, if you do that, you're gonna mistype a lot of people. Sensing types, when they make analogies, they're often very clear. I understand exactly what you were talking about with that analogy, and it's like not that much of a leap to say this thing is analogous to this thing. To make like a stupidly simple example, it's like, it's not that difficult for me to see intuitively a car and a garage are analogous to a horse and a barn. You know what I'm saying? But they will use very concrete analogies where it's like, yes, this thing is exactly the same as this other thing in the intuitive pattern, but I can see clearly you're proving the analogy. Intuitives though, they will give you the most like obtuse, opaque, nebulous analogies, and it's like, my neighbor, what are you really trying to say here? Because I could read into this many different ways. A lot of times the intuitive analogies will seem like, oh wow, that's a really elegant way of describing that thing, but it's just like not always the most easy thing to comprehend. And I'm not saying that like, oh, they're so smart. I'm saying like, actually, it's not clear to anyone except them. All right, now last but not least, and I think this is the thing that people like to focus in on first, but it's actually not always the most obvious thing, but it's guessing. It's that future forecasting, how intuitives are supposed to be able to like see what's going to happen next. And I think this, sometimes a lot of people who are a little bit more hippy dippy, they're like, oh, intuitives, they're like, these otherworldly creatures. They can see what is going to happen next, but they're really just guessing. Intuitives love guessing. And this goes back, if I can go to the overview here, it all goes back to intuitives are about the overview, categorizing, let's not look at specifics, whereas sensors are like, let's look at the specifics and see what is in reality. A lot of the guessing that intuitives do is necessary because they haven't been paying attention to the facts or anything. So it's like, yeah, you've got to do a lot of guessing if you're only looking at categories and overviews and you're like, I don't know if these facts are right or not. Let me just guess at how they're all connected. Let me just guess at what's going to happen next because Lord knows I haven't been paying attention to what has actually been happening. Intuitives naturally anticipate what's going to happen next in the future, and they've been doing it their whole lives because they've preferred intuition their whole lives. They've been using it so much that they get good at it to the point where they just take it for granted that, yeah, what I'm guessing is going to happen next. What I see the pattern is, yeah, that's what's going to happen next. It's not magical. It's not like there's some oracle peering into the future. It's really just like pattern recognition to the point where it might be like totally unconscious. They might not realize what the pattern is. They might not be able to say to you, oh, I know it because of this, this, and this. It's just, it arises in their brain. They're like, here's the intuitive connection that I am guessing at. Intuitives love to jump to conclusions when they get the gist of what the facts seem to suggest. Sensing types will sometimes jump to conclusions, but it's like usually not good because they don't use the intuition as much. They don't rely on it. So when they're jumping to a conclusion, it's like, dude, just stick to the facts, okay? Yeah, intuitives will naturally just guess at what is going on with very few details. And once again, because they've been doing it their whole life, a lot of times they're pretty good at it, or at least they think they're pretty good, or at least they feel good about making that guess, even if they have a track record of being wrong. The sensing types, it pains them to guess at that kind of stuff because they're like, we don't really know what's gonna happen next. If you're not looking closely at the facts, you're gonna make a mistake at some point. And the intuitives do make a lot of mistakes. I mean, doesn't everyone? We're only human. But it makes sensing types super uncomfortable to be like, we have very few details. We can't just like guess what's gonna happen next. That makes the sensing types much better suited for situations like making important decisions that require a lot of data, like business decisions and things like that. Intuitive types are the kind who will like try stuff over and over and guess at what's going wrong, and then one of their sensing friends is like, hey, have you actually just written down the numbers and looked at what's actually happening here? And the intuitive's like, no, I figured it out intuitively. And the sensing type is like, okay, cool. I'm actually just gonna, figure out the data, and that will point me in the direction of reality. Okay, now that leads us into the imagination aspect of this, because I think one of the misconceptions is, oh, intuitives, they're really imaginative people, and sensing types, they don't have an imagination. Now, here's where this comes from, because there's a little bit of truth to it. Intuitives are using their imagination all the time because, they're imagining future outcomes. They're imagining where are things gonna go next. They're processing what is the pattern going on here. Now, let me make a distinction. Imagination is not the same as intuition. Like, intuition is the process, generally, of, becoming aware of that abstract stuff, of the overviews, of the patterns, and imagination is like the tool in your mind that can be used for that, among other things. So sensing types have an imagination. Everyone has an imagination, duh. But the thing is, the sensing types are just using their imagination when they have to. It's another tool in their toolbox to be used. They don't have to use it all the time because they are relying on the sensing. They're relying on the facts and what is actually observable. Here's the thing though, with those sensing types, because they're not using their imagination all the time for all these silly reasons like the intuitives, when they do rely on their intuition, they know when to pull it out. When are the most appropriate times to make a guess, to think about the future, to do a little bit of that brainstorming, think of all the possibilities. When those sensors get a little more confident in that intuition, it's scary. It could even blow the intuitives out of the water because the intuitives are just a mess. They're just using their imagination all the time. It's like, dude, now is not the time to be relying on intuition. But they're like, yes it is. is, every time, all the time, is a time to be using my intuition. Yeah. So everyone's got an imagination. That was my summary. Let me know in the comments section if I confused you even more. What questions you may have about intuition versus sensing or anything else having to do with the 16 personalities. Until next time, stay cool and attractive.
They say strangers come to town.